on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter.
Advocates for Cuban political prisoners testified about that country's human rights record at a House hearing today. The witnesses were critical of attempts to reestablish diplomatic relations with Cuba. New Jersey Republican Chris Smith chairs the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Global Human Rights. This is 2 hours, 40 minutes.
Good morning to everyone, and welcome to this very timely and important hearing on human rights in Cuba. We are here to examine the state of human rights, which is a very timely topic indeed, given the Obama administration's sea change in policy towards Cuba announced at the end of last year. We are here to ask whether, in undertaking this change in policy, the Obama administration used the considerable leverage that it wields to seek to better the condition of the Cuban people, or whether, as I fear, as an opportunity that was squandered in its haste to achieve a diplomatic breakthrough and even create a legacy for the president. Thus, this hearing is not only about Castro regime accountability, but also the Obama administration's accountability, with Congress exercising its role of both oversight and as a bully pulpit for reminding the world that Cuba remains a communist dictatorship which continues to arrest political dissidents. And I would underscore an estimated 178 political dissidents in the last month alone, and one whose caudillo, Raul Castro, has declared would not change even in response to the Obama administration's concessions. This Castro regime continues to harbor fugitives from justice, such as Joanne Chesimard, who was convicted in the 1973 murder of a state trooper in my own home state of New Jersey. Officer Werner Forrester was gunned down gangland style after she escaped from prison. Indeed, just yesterday we had the Assistant Secretary for State for the Western Hemisphere, Roberta Jacobson, appear before the full Committee of Foreign Affairs. I asked her what the response of the Cuban government was when she raised the issue of the return of Joanne Chesimard to justice. She replied that the Cuban government stated that it was, quote, not interested in discussing her return, close quote. That is absolutely unacceptable. I have in my hands a statement which I asked to be submitted for the record from Christopher Burgos, the president of the State Troopers Fraternal Organization in New Jersey, where he states on behalf of our Jersey State Troopers that, quote, we are shocked and very disappointed that returning a convicted killer of a state trooper was not already demanded and accomplished in the context of the steps announced by the White House regarding this despotic dictatorship. I would also point out that, as an aside, that both President Burgos and New Jersey State Police Superintendent Colonel Rick Fuentes both very much wanted to be here, and we will have another hearing to hear from them, and I look forward to that follow-up hearing. But unfortunately, we do have with us, fortunately, and it is a tremendous honor and a privilege to have with us today, three extraordinarily brave and uniquely qualified witnesses to the brutality of the Cuban dictatorship. Three human rights activists who, at great personal cost to themselves and their families, have and continue to stand up for human dignity. We will hear about the deplorable state of human rights in Cuba. Just read the State Department report on human rights, as well as other reporting that has been done by other NGOs. And it couldn't be more clear that human rights are violated with impunity by the Castro brothers and their regime. I would note parenthetically that years ago, during the Reagan administration, I met with Armando Valladares, who spent almost 2 decades in the Cuban Gulag system. And I will never forget when I went and read his book. He actually led a delegation to the United Nations UN Commission. Matter of fact, Ileana and her staff, we went time and time again to that commission, asking them to look at the deplorable state of human rights in Cuba. When I was with Armando Valladares, I was in awe of his courage as well. He was able to get the UN to look at, pass a resolution condemning the deplorable situation in Cuba, and to deploy a team to go to the prisons and investigate these terrible abuses of human rights. There were promises made by Fidel Castro that there would be no retaliation whatsoever against those who spoke in prison and the family members who came forward and friends to bear witness to a terrible truth and set of truths. Everybody was retaliated against. The people in the prisons, as well as their families. And regrettably, the UN was unable, perhaps unwilling, but certainly unable to do anything to mitigate it or to stop that retaliation. I have pushed for years to go to Cuba. I've been denied a visa for 2 decades or so. I want to go to the prisons. Of course, I'll meet with Fidel if I am able to lead a delegation or even go on my own with my staff. We can't get that visa. Both Frank Wolf and I tried a number of times, and it got so bad that at one point Fidel Castro said that we were provocateurs. I want to go meet with the dissidents. Frank Wolf and I got into prisons in the Soviet Union, the infamous Perm Camp 35, where people like Natan Sharansky suffered and were tortured by that communist dictatorship. When Shoshana Guzmão, who became the president of East Timor, I went and saw him when he was in Jakarta and went to prisons all over the world. But we can't get into Cuba. We even got into Beijing prison number 2, where 40 Tiananmen Square activists were being forced to do gulag labor, head shaved, gaunt, looked like concentration camp victims. And yet, Mr. Wolf and I, could not and I can't get into those prisons. So I will be asking the government again, have already asked, and I've asked our government to help facilitate it, to go to the prisons. And even on the ICRC yesterday, the Red Cross, I asked Secretary Jacobson, and I said, you know, much has been made that the ICRC might be able to get into the country. That's unacceptable. Get into the prisons. And again, there has to be absolutely no retaliation to those who speak out. I would point out that after testifying here today in public, and I thank C-SPAN especially and the journalists for taking this story and making Americans aware of what is actually happening in Cuba right now as we meet. They will be returning to Cuba. And this committee, and I know the entire Congress will be watching to ensure that their safety and well-being and health is not further jeopardized. But the courage to come forward to a congressional hearings, our friends over on the Senate side received compelling testimony as well, and to bear witness to an ugly truth of torture. I would ask everyone to go back and reread Against All Hope, Armando Valladares' famous book. He talked about tortures that I don't even want to mention in public. They are so despicable, of putting dissidents in vats of excrement, so bad that it went into their ears and nose and they got infections. Armando Valladares told me that when he and his wife, when they finally got to the United States and got asylum, that when he couldn't even change his children's diapers because the smell of excrement brought back instantaneously, like PTSD, remembrances of that kind of degrading and cruelty imposed upon them. The Castro brothers and many in this regime ought to be at The Hague for crimes against humanity. That's how bad it is. These are among the worst abusers of human rights in the entire world. So again, I want to welcome our brave and courageous witnesses. I want to thank Ileana Ross-Layton and Mario Diaz-Balart. Ileana has been such a leader for so long in raising the truth of what is going on in this Gulag island. I have much more to say, but I will put the rest of it into the record. But I do want to thank our witnesses again, and I look forward to hearing their testimony. I yield to my good friend and colleague, Ms. Bass, the gentlelady from California.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I ask you to censure
Mr. Chairman, I just want to take a brief moment before we turn to the very serious topic of human rights in Cuba to respond to a statement from this subcommittee's last hearing that had troubling interpretations. While discussing your position on marriage equality, you made comments and engaged in a line of questioning that some understood as suggesting that lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people do not have basic human rights. After exchanging letters with you, I think it's important to note that while we do have very different opinions on marriage equality, you strongly oppose it, I strongly support it, we both agree that unequivocally LGBT people have the same rights as all other people to live lives free from violence and persecution. In your letter and your public statement, you said that you, and I quote, unequivocally oppose acts of violence against anyone and believe that human rights apply to all, end quote. And that, and I quote again, all individuals, including LGBT persons, should be treated with respect and compassion. I want to thank you for the opportunity to clear up the confusion over your statement and to reaffirm our shared passion for protecting the human rights of all people. The policy of the United States is absolutely clear. LGBT rights are human rights, and LGBT people are entitled to live lives free from violence, intimidation, discrimination, and harm. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. I would just again say we do have a fundamental difference. I don't support homosexual marriage. I know you do, and I certainly respect your views. And I do want to point out that I am for universally recognized human rights for all. And there is no treaty that recognizes a right to marriage for homosexuals. But again, I'm glad we were able to work together, and I'd like to. Oh. Okay, why don't you go? Okay, you go.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I do appreciate the clarification of that, because I know with your long record on human rights that you would never be okay with the egregious human rights violations that are taking place around the world in the LGBT community, and that there is a fundamental difference between marriage, which many people have a difference around, but I know that there is no difference around LGBT rights and the violence and opposing the violence against LGBT people. So thank you for that. Today's hearing on human rights in Cuba in the context of President Obama's recent announcement, I said yesterday in our Foreign Affairs Committee that sometimes in talking about Cuba, it's difficult because my colleagues and two of my colleagues that are on the other side of the aisle right now in this hearing have family history and personal situations that make it very difficult if one does have a different opinion. I want to, one, respect and acknowledge what my colleagues have been through and what their families have been through, and with no disrespect or disregard for those histories, want to take a few minutes and propose a different viewpoint. You know, the President's policy of opening up relations with Cuba, I actually think is a very good thing, especially for people who are concerned about human rights. During the 5 decades that we have not had relations with the Cuban government and the Cuban people, the Cuban economy did experience multiple economic shocks, which really produced hardships for the people, but none of it really produced the kind of popular uprisings or internal resistance that might have led to a change in government. I also think that the embargo prohibited diplomatic and economic engagement between the U.S. and Cuba, and I think that many times is the ways in which societies become more open and accountable and democratic, and trade and cultural exchange becomes mutually beneficial. I think the embargo has impeded U.S. relations throughout the Western Hemisphere, as many Latin American nations viewed the embargo itself as a human rights violation against the Cuban people. I have to say that as a U.S. citizen, I definitely consider it my human right to be able to travel to any nation on the earth. And I have resented the fact that it has been difficult. I mean, Americans can go to Cuba, and I have been to Cuba, but it's very, very difficult to go there. And I don't believe, and I might be wrong, but I don't believe that we have that restriction against any other nation in the world, including Iran, North Korea, and Saudi Arabia, all of which have extremely troubling human rights records. Such travel restrictions, as well as those of trade, also violate the freedom of U.S. citizens. In recent polling by CBS, ABC News, and the Washington Post revealed that a majority of Americans are supportive of moving away from the policy of disengagement and toward reestablishing ties with Cuba. I also think that engagement would be good for the Cuban people, as people-to-people exchanges and the Cuban-American family travel would increase cultural engagement, assist in family reunification, And this opening of space will provide improved access to Cuba for non-governmental organizations that are focused on governance and human rights, as well as facilitating technical assistance to Cuban civil society groups concerned with improved standards of economic and personal freedoms. I do have to say, Mr. Chair, you mentioned about visiting prisons in Cuba. When I did go, I did visit Alan Gross, and I visited him in prison. And I think that it was important that during the time that Mr. Gross was incarcerated, that a number of members of Congress went over and visited him and pushed for his release, and I think that that was a contributing factor. Again, I just feel that you really can't change people and governments whom you refuse to engage with. And so increased engagement, to me, seems like it would be a contributing factor to improving the human rights situation on the island of Cuba, and I look forward to the testimony from our witnesses today. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. I'd like to now yield to the Chairwoman Emeritus of the full Committee on Foreign Affairs, Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Leite.
Thank you very much, and I also am glad that Mr. Gross is home, but if by visiting Mr. Gross you believe that you have been to a Cuban jail, maybe these dissidents here could tell you what a Cuban jail is really like. But we're thankful that he's home. Or we could ask someone like Mr. Basilio Guzman, who's in the audience today. He served 22 years in Castro's prison. And Mr. Smith, I would like to request unanimous consent to submit into the record a letter from the International Committee of Former Cuban Political Prisoners based in Union City, New Jersey, documenting a list of the many Cubans who are still languishing in Castro's gulag. And thank you to Mr. Guzman for pointing that out.
The objection's ordered.
Thank you. Mr. Smith, I want to thank you so very much for convening this important hearing, for your unyielding and passionate commitment to human rights, to freedom, not just for the oppressed people of Cuba, but for all people everywhere who suffer under oppressive regimes and who continue to seek the most basic and fundamental rights for many people that they take for granted. Everywhere there is an oppressed person, a political prisoner, there you will find Mr. Smith. So we thank you for that. I also want to welcome our wonderful witnesses, Berta Soler, Sara Fonseca, and Tunis, all champions of freedom on the island and the face of what the democratic future of Cuba will look like. Look at those faces. That is the Cuba now. That is the free Cuba of tomorrow. These are brave pro-democracy activists who have seen firsthand the brutality of the regime by the constant arrests and beatings that they have had to endure, the isolation that they've had to endure while in jail. They did not have food prepared especially for them. They were starved, and after this hearing they will be going back to Cuba, amazingly enough, as you pointed out, Mr. Smith, to continue the fight for freedom and democracy. Berta, as a matter of fact, she will be marching with her sisters, the ladies in white, las damas de blanco, this very Sunday. And by the way, while all these negotiations are going on, there were 13 detentions of the ladies in white just last Sunday. So if you think everything is rosy and bright and terrific and all wonderful, just ask these three dissidents what life is like for them. Very unlike what we hear from others. Our witnesses are just three of the countless faces of Cuba who represent the future, who the administration has shut out of the negotiations. And rarely are they invited to meet with visiting dignitaries. We're glad that they get the chance to go to Cuba. Rarely do they invite dissidents who disagree with this administration. These are the people who have to suffer the consequences of the administration's decisions. It's easy for the president to change this policy in his ivory tower. These are the faces who must now suffer under a Castro regime, re-energized. The regime is re-energized by President Obama's policies, by its injections of cash. The president's December 17th announcement serves to both embolden the regime by implying that it can continue its repressive machinery with impunity. Raul Castro said, "We will not change," and we look the other way. It undercuts and it demoralizes the brave freedom fighters in Cuba who rightfully believe that the U.S. has turned its back on them. But don't confuse the U.S. people with the administration, just like we don't confuse the Castro regime with the people of Cuba. And for what are these negotiations? So that more Americans can travel to Cuba and see what the regime wants them to see. All the while, the regime fills its coffers and we ignore the truth. Because who owns the hotels? The Castro regime. Who runs the hotels? The Castro military. The truth about the Cuban regime is that it is a regime that severely punishes dissidents, even to this day. El Decano was sentenced to a year in prison just last week. A young rapper. A rapper is a threat to this regime. Did he commit a crime? No. His charge was dangerousness, which could lead to a crime. It's the precogs of that movie. They predict that you're going to commit a crime, so they arrest you before you commit it. This regime forbids reform and will do anything to maintain its grip on power. The censorship apparatus, one of the most comprehensive in the world. It forbids Cubans from listening to independent, private, or foreign broadcasts, and even censors the signal of its own allies' televised propaganda. It is important, Mr. Chairman, that we understand exactly the kind of murderous regime we're dealing with in Cuba and that President Obama wants to normalize relations with. On November 4th, 1999, the House Committee on International Relations convened a congressional hearing entitled "The Cuban Program: Torture of American Prisoners by Cuban Agents." At that hearing, you remember, Mr. Chairman, we heard testimony from American POWs, prisoners of war, who were tortured at a prison camp in North Vietnam known as the Zoo during the period of August 67 to August 68. According to reports, 19 of those courageous servicemen were psychologically tortured and beaten by Cuban agents working under orders from Hanoi. And while the State Department led the negotiations last month in Havana, its very own country reports on human rights practices for 2013 states this: the following additional abuses continued: harsh prison conditions, arbitrary arrests, selective prosecution, denial of free trial. This is from the State Department, our State Department. They're still negotiating with Castro while this is going on. Authorities interfered with privacy, engaging in pervasive monitoring of private conversations. The government did not respect freedom of speech and press, severely restricted Internet access, and maintained a monopoly on media outlets, circumscribed academic freedom, and maintained significant restrictions on the ability of religious groups to meet and worship. Our own State Department, the government refused to recognize independent human rights groups or permit them to function legally. They can tell you about that. In addition, the government continued to prevent workers from forming independent unions. Where are these voices who are so much for independent unions here in the United States? But not for you. You're not good enough. I'm sorry, no union for you. The most human rights abuse committed at the direction of the government. Our own State Department says this: impunity for the perpetrators remain widespread, end quote. Because I could continue. Mr. Chairman, we cannot be the land of the free across the world if this administration doesn't defend democracy right here in our own hemisphere. We cannot call for democratic reform and values throughout the world if we abandon them 90 miles from our shores. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this time. Welcome to our panelists.
Chairwoman Ross-Leighton, thank you for that extraordinarily powerful statement and for your consistent support, again, not only of the Cuban people, but people who are dealing with tyrannies all over the world.
I hope you get your visa.
Thank you.
Don't hold your breath.
I'd like to now yield to my friend and colleague, Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and Ranking Member Bass for calling today's hearing on this very important issue. I particularly want to thank the witnesses who are here today, and thank you in advance for sharing your insight and your experiences. And I know that some of you are bravely joining us today to share very personal stories of very difficult and painful experiences, and we are really indebted to you for your willingness to do that. As I discussed yesterday with the administration witnesses during our full committee hearing, I like many, continue to have deep concerns about how the Cuban government treats its citizens. But it's clear that the United States policy on Cuba over the past several decades has not worked either. And I'm hopeful that President Obama's effort to engage in real, substantive negotiations toward more honest cultural exchange, economic trade, and diplomatic ties with Cuba will ultimately benefit the United States and, more importantly, the Cuban people. I hope the Cuban government will come to the negotiating table with a real desire to work with the United States toward a more free, open, and tolerant society for the Cuban people. And it's very important for us to pay close attention to the ongoing negotiations to make sure that any changes are implemented in a way that maintains our commitment to promoting basic values and human rights. So I thank the witnesses again for being here and look forward to your perspective as the relationship between the United States and Cuba begins to change. And with that, I yield back, Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman.
Mr. Salini. Well, now I yield to my good friend and colleague who has been a very powerful voice, Mario Diaz-Balart, and thank him for joining us. He's a member of the Appropriations Committee, and he does us the honor of being here today.
Mr. Chairman, let me first thank you for the opportunity to sit in for a few minutes. I will not be able to stay for the entirety of the hearing because I do have other meetings to go to, but I could not let this moment pass without first thanking you, sir, for your just steadfast leadership and your consistent leadership, whether it's been fighting for freedom and supporting the opposition in Vietnam and Communist China and North Korea, wherever there has been oppression. Mr. Chairman, you have always been consistent, just like Chairwoman Emeritus Ileana Ros-Lehtinen. And I want to thank both of you. And I just want to make a couple of comments. And the ranking member, who was very kind in her introduction, mentioned about how some of us might have some family history. The issue of human rights has nothing to do with family history, because I, for one, am opposed to oppression in Communist China, in North Korea, in Vietnam. And I don't know, I was a very young man when we had sanctions against South Africa, and I supported the sanctions in South Africa. I'm assuming that the ranking member was also opposed to sanctions in South Africa, because I'm assuming, obviously, that she is also as consistent as the chairman is on these issues. I supported, as a young man, those sanctions against South Africa, because doing business with the apartheid regime was not to help the struggling freedom, folks who were struggling for freedom in South Africa. All it did was help prop up that regime in South Africa. So, Mr. Chairman, I couldn't let this time slide by without me being here.
Can I ask the gentleman to yield for a second?
Of course, with all pleasure.
You know, I really was only trying to acknowledge the fact that I realized people had personal situations.
And I appreciate
wasn't
that.
trying to say that, you know, that's the only reason you're concerned about Cuba. It's just hard if you have a different opinion. I just wanted to respect what I knew you and Ileana's family had been through. That was all.
And I thank the ranking woman, and as I said, for your kind statements. I took it as a kind statement. So I want to make sure of that. But I'm just saying that the issue of human rights and the consistency on that is important. When we look at the folks that are here today, I mentioned South Africa. In front of us today are the Mandelas, are the Havels, are the future leaders of a free and democratic Cuba. When folks talk about Cuba, they sometimes confuse the regime with Cuba. No, this is Cuba in front of us today. They who have spent years in prison, Jorge Luis Garcia Perez Antunes, 17 years in prison. By the way, ask him about the conditions of the prisons. Ask Iris Aguilera about how well the Cuban people are treated. Ask Sara Marta Fonseca. Just go to the YouTube and look at her videos to find out how respected and how well the Cuban people who dare just speak out for freedom are treated. Ask Berta Soler about what happens when you just walk peacefully with a flower in your hand going to church and asking for freedom of their relatives. Ask her how the Cuban people are treated. So at a time when, during the State of the Union, our president spoke about Cuba, and by the way, for the first time in my recollection, did I see a president speak in the State of Union, in the Union about Cuba and not even mention human rights, not even mention democracy, not even give lip service to elections in Cuba. I am grateful to you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing these heroes, the future leaders, them and others, the future leaders of Cuba, to the United States Congress to testify. Because again, at a time when our president has decided to ignore the repression, the arrests, heck, even the sending of arms to North Korea from the Castro regime, this House, as it always has, will continue to stand with you, with the future leaders of Cuba, with the people of Cuba, and not with the regime. I am grateful for the opportunity, Mr. Chairman, to be able to sit in here for a few minutes. Thank you, sir. I yield
Yes,
back.
Ballard, thank you so very much for your very powerful statement, and which has been consistent throughout the world. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Emmer, gentleman from Minnesota.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and it's difficult to follow that from a new colleague. So I won't try to follow that. All I will do is say thank you for this hearing, Mr. Chairman, and especially in light of the President's decision to somehow restart diplomacy with the regime currently in charge in Cuba. They talk, and there are still concerns for some of us about why the President would have used the process he used, sidestepping the State Department, having over a year of secret meetings that didn't involve normal process. But that part aside, it really is all about the human rights and the Cuban people. Which is why it's so interesting to me. The discussion about normalization of the relationship is really what we're here about today. And I appreciate that you and the ranking member have decided that we're going to bring in some people to talk about some basic freedoms, the situation, exercise the oversight that is the jurisdiction of this committee, because thankfully the President has acknowledged that he does not have the authority to dismantle, as he suggested, the embargo and start to normalize relationships with Cuba. That's up to Congress. And hopefully it starts here today. We can talk about how people can have basic and fundamental rights to assemble with people that they want, to speak freely on their own behalf, and God forbid, even against their government. And that people can actually practice their faith in public and be proud of it. I'm looking forward to being part of the process, and I thank you again for holding this hearing, and for the witnesses, I look forward to your testimony today, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Emmer. I'd like to yield to Ms. Pitcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
A leader on religious freedom, especially in this Congress, and on Chinese human rights.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I deeply appreciate being here, and forgive me for being late. But I want to come to pay tremendous respect to those who've come to testify today. Each of us are still searching on the merits of why the President would make the unilateral decision that he made to provide a diplomatic relationship with Cuba against the wisdom of a dozen previous presidents. What he has done is elevate a terrorist state. Along with Cuba is Syria, Sudan, Iran, that are terrorist states. And now he's declared to the world that this state is acceptable to the United States. It's a very sad day. I have worked for the last 30 years with missionaries in Cuba. They tell me the plight of the religious inequities and the challenges that they face, and people trying to live out their faith. So I'm deeply concerned over the impact of what will happen, the elevation we've given to the Marxist doctrine that will be encouraged throughout the world. We have dealt with Cuba on an ongoing basis in the United Nations. They have sought to engage those to oppose the United states and those of our closest allies, including Israel. So I'm here to pay respect to you and thank you for your commitment and to clearly say to you that we stand with you, fully engaged in behalf of the wonderful people of Cuba. Thank you and God bless you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pittenger. Now, it is now a very distinct honor and privilege to welcome our very distinguished witnesses. They are doing here today in Washington, which they would not be able to do in Cuba, especially before that rogue Congress, where there is really no real election. There's no free and fair elections. Let me begin first with Mr. Jorge Luis Garcia Perez Antunez, who is a leader in the Cuban democratic movement. He was inspired early in life by reading the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, rejecting the communist indoctrination that he was receiving in Cuba's schools. Antunez, as he is known to us all as, is a leader of a nonviolent movement to promote human rights and democracy. He was arrested in 1990 for peacefully protesting the Castro brothers' oppressive regime, and spent the next 17 years in jail as a political prisoner. He endured horrific torture, beatings, solitary confinement, and denial of needed medical care that almost cost him his life. Since his release in 2007, Antunez has continued to advance the cause of freedom and human rights in Cuba. He also knows firsthand the discrimination suffered by Afro-Cubans on a daily basis and under-focused upon aggressive racism employed by the Castro regime. We will then hear from Ms. Berta Soler, who has been the leader of the Ladies in White movement following the death of the group's founder, Laura Poyan, in 2011. The Ladies in White is a movement of wives and female relatives of Cuban political prisoners, but now has evolved into a potent, powerful human rights group open to all Cuban women. Ms. Solar and 4 other members of the Ladies in White received the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought by the European Parliament in 2006. But the Castro brothers barred them from attending the awards ceremony. She and her husband has remained in Cuba since his release, rejecting an offer of immigration from Spain in order to continue their struggle for human rights and democracy in Cuba. I would also note that the Ladies in White have been nominated by Yolanda Ross-Layton and I and others in a joint request to the Nobel Peace Prize Committee, along with Dr. Bichette, another Afro-Cuban, a medical doctor, who has been tortured horrifically as well. He testified here, as you know, by way of a phone hookup and told us, do not end the embargo. Get the conditions first. Get human rights and durable human rights at that before that embargo is lifted. And he said it even though there's great risk to himself in articulating that. He pointed out, as many others have pointed out, that the Europeans have been trading with Cuba for decades with no amelioration whatsoever and have been a lifeline, frankly, to a dictatorship which Russia first provided, then Venezuela, and unfortunately trade coming in from Europe and Canada. Then we'll hear from Ms. Sarah Fonseca, who grew up in a household that opposed the communist system based on their principles and their deep religious beliefs. Due to her family's faith, she was denied the right to complete her studies. In 2004, she became a member of the Pro-Human Rights Party affiliated with the Andrei Sakharov Foundation. In 2009, she joined the Rosa Parks Civil Rights Women's Movement, for which she became the delegate in the city of Havana. That same year, she also began participating with the Ladies in White as a lady of support. She and her family have experienced numerous state-organized mob attacks, and her house has been vandalized and searched by government agents dressed in civilian clothes. As a result, she has sought refugee status in the United States. Then we'll hear from Mr. Jeff Thale, who oversees the entire range of the Washington Office of the Latin America's Research and Advocacy in Latin America Policy and Human Rights Issues. Along with a focus on specific countries and themes, Mr. Thale led the team that authored Forging New Ties, WOLA's recommendations for new directions in U.S. policy towards Latin America. Mr. Thale has studied Cuba issues since the mid-1990s and traveled to Cuba more than a dozen times. Wish I could get that visa, including organizing delegations of academics and members of Congress. He coordinates WOLA's advocacy of this issue with coalition of business, agricultural, and human rights groups who favor lifting the general travel ban on Cuba. I'd like to now yield the floor to Antunes.
Bueno, honorable congresista Christopher Smith.
Honorable Congressman Christopher Smith.
Muy buenos días a todos los congresistas invitados.